Hey guys, in this video we're going to be going back and revisiting the McFarlane Toys Spawn Classic Series 20. This is Violator 3. So let's get some measurements going for the Violator. Violator stands almost by a little bit, almost 8 inches tall. Now the first time I had a look at this figure was way back in February 26, 2012. So there's a gap of give or take about 5 years. The last time I looked at him to the time I'm looking at him now. And you may ask yourself, why specifically are we looking at Violator 3 again? Well, that's because this is one of my favorite figures of all time. In fact, I would say this figure falls within my top 5 favorite figures of all time, right up there with the NECA Toys Friday the 13th Part 4 Jason, as well as the DC Comics Superheroes Clayface, which would be of my top 3. I might even dare say that this guy is within my top 3 favorite figures of all time. Between the sculpt and the paint of this guy, he still is a figure that I can go back to now and appreciate. I don't feel like he's got much in the way of toy rust, so to speak. And I liked this figure so much that at one point I thought I lost him, and I went ahead and bought a second one of him. So here we have dueling Violators, which sounds strange. I think, in fact, this was my original Violator, because I've noticed that there's a little bit of paint that's been worn on the eyes. This, I think, is the newer of the two Violators. This one generally kind of stands a little bit better, I've noticed as well. Like, even though they are pretty much this exact same figure, there's, for some reason, this one poses better. And it might just be my craziness looking at the figures, but I find like this guy just stands better. So usually this is the one that I would have on display. And I think the original one I have here, I've just stored away. So we'll just move him out of the way. So this is the third, I guess, release of Violator, obviously upping its game not only with sculpt, but mild upgrade on articulation. That's one thing, unfortunately, that McFarlane stuff just doesn't. It dates itself only by the way I find it's posed, and the way it's pre-posed or the way it's articulated makes these figures seem dated. But I find like the sculpts on them are still very, very good, and in fact almost trumps some of the stuff that we get nowadays. So Violator here, if you are fairly new to Violator, he's basically a minion of Malbolgia that comes to Earth to oversee and keep an eye on Spawn. Generally he takes the form of the clown, but if you get him angry enough and he needs to push his weight around, he turns into this fantastic monstrosity. It's one of my favorite aspects of Spawn. I like Spawn, but one of my favorite things was always Violator. I just loved the look of him. And there's variations of Violator as well. There's a couple of different creatures, Vindicator, and I think there's other ones as well. But Violator to me is like my all-time favorite character from like the 90s. He just has such a cool look to him. I think the figure does it justice for recreating Violator in plastic form. He definitely has like all the cool aspects that Violator has, from like the curved back, the very cool spikes that are protruding out from his elbows, wrists, and especially up the torso area here. And one of the most notable factors and features of Violator is the very distinct face, which nowadays in comics, it's so very hard to come up with a new design for a character without it kind of looking like other things. Violator, to this day, I still think has his own very unique look to him. He doesn't really look like anything else, and there's very few things nowadays that have mimicked the look of Violator. He does have an open and closed mouth, so I mean you can close his mouth, which kind of looks a little bit more like how the first Violator figure came, which I think had more wire frames. You'd be able to bend the arms and bend the legs because they had a wire frame, but they very, very little had articulation. As the figure has upgraded, so has also the posability. And again, you can do a little bit more on this guy that you could do with the original. But like, look at the fantastic details on this guy. You can get very close-up look at his eyes. You see all the little scales and wrinkles here on the top of his forehead. I love the discoloration on the teeth, how they've got a darker gray right where the teeth plug themselves into the gum line. That looks really cool. And then, of course, you've got the additional detailing there of the black wash on the horns. Really add a little extra oomph, which I always am for, an extra oomph. You got a little bit of that spine spinal, I guess, makeup of Violator. And really love the sculpt of his tongue, where you've got the tongue curled at the bottom here. It looks like it's almost wet by the way that they've applied the paint to it. And there's like a little bit of just a rubber bend, just a little bit of a rubberness to the tongue, which I quite like. The teeth, while the top are more of a solid plastic, the bottom teeth are rubber. And despite the fact that this figure is fairly old, the teeth as well as the tongue have still held up. Sometimes with rubber, you gotta be careful that this doesn't deteriorate over time. But the teeth seem to have held up well also as the tongue. The paint really is fantastic on this guy. Again, all these super cool details. I'm gonna move the arm out of the way. And you can see like all the little folds of flesh underneath him here. Kind of where just everything comes together. It's a design really that theoretically shouldn't work because it just doesn't, it looks like it's so much a mess of different things thrown together. But I find Violator just has always been a really successful design for me. The skin is almost that of, I almost want to say like a rhino, where you've got like this sort of cross-hatched flesh that's been sculpted onto the figure. Again, that same dark discoloration that the teeth had also are on the spikes that stick out from his back. And that runs all the way down. You've got the spikes sticking out from the elbow area here. Again, as well, let's flip the figure around. Some really cool, giant-sized hands. And we'll bring the hand around so you can see on this side too. He's got these great-looking hands. I love these. They're almost like xenomorph hands, very long fingers. You got the fingernails, of course, painted almost the same coloring really as the horns. And then his legs have that bend to them where he's got like the hind leg sort of thing, the bend at the opposite end. The feet are curled nicely too. And also, that's one of the problems I have with the figure. We'll get into that in a second. But one of the things I like about the feet though is the fact that even though the feet are arched in a way that really makes you think that he doesn't stand well, he actually stands extremely well, almost to the point I wouldn't even consider putting a display stand on him because he's so well-footed. He seems to, I guess, sit more so on the forward end of his feet rather than the ball end of the back heel, but he stands extremely well, even when you pose him. The arms are very simple, just pegs. I mean, there's no ball joints. I would love to see a customizer be able to kind of customize this guy where they give him like ball joints, because imagining if they could somehow hollow this out and make a ball joint on the shoulders where you could hinge the arms outward. Same thing with the legs. That's the only thing I would say I would change about the figure is I really wish that McFarlane could have gone back and given this guy more posability. Now that can work as a detriment as well. We've seen that with other figures too, that sometimes you put too much articulation, like for example the Diamond Select Terror Dog had way too much going on here that it made almost posing him next to impossible. I would keep this completely as is. I wouldn't give him a hinge or anything in the knee, because I've learned my lesson with NECA Toys Alien figures. A bend at the knee for a figure that stands like this generally means that joint is going to get loose over time. The joint on Violator is really only loose by where the joints attach to the waist, but you're really not adding a lot of weight to that anyways, so it seems perfectly fine. One of the other interesting things that they did with Violator here is that they added, for some strange reason, a rubber cap over top of his elbow. They've done it to hide his articulation, but he doesn't really have articulation to start off with. If he did have any sort of an elbow bend, it would certainly not be at a place where I would entertain the idea of bending it, because I would fear that this would break, and all the more reason why I haven't really done much in the way of bending the elbows here. I wish that he had a swivel in the actual bicep area, because I keep finding myself wanting to do this with his arms. And a lot of times when I do that, as you can probably see, the arms pop out of their sockets. Let's run through his posability though. His head doesn't have anything, but he does have a slight, I say very slight, pivot in his torso. You really can't do all that much with it because there's really very little clearance. I mean, you can rotate him to really about that, and you can rotate him to kind of like that. which again gives him some extra, extra ways to pose him. I'm perfectly fine actually just displaying him, front forward like this. The arms do rotate all the way around, but do find yourself probably from time to time replacing the arm because the arm has just simply popped itself off the socket here. The elbow, again, is just a tricky thing to figure out. It seems like it wants to bend, and it would entertain the idea of that because he's got the rubber kind of capping over top of it. But without really being able to see what's inside there, I can only gauge that he does have the hinge in the elbow, but I really don't want to play around with it all that much. The hands, I should say, do rotate, so you can have the hands upward. And I think there was a couple of different package variations for this guy as well, one of which I believe came with the heart. Over the course of time, of course, collecting this guy and having him in bags and moving around and moving from one house to another sort of thing, I've lost whatever he came with, which I think was the heart. I think there was also a variation of him as well that came with something else. I pretty much have like the bare release of this guy currently in my collection. Losing whatever he would have come with doesn't really take anything away from the figure because I think the figure is still good whether he has anything or not. The legs do hinge, but they are kind of in that V-cut swivel. So, I mean, the legs rotate, but as they rotate this way. They don't rotate straight. And then finally, for the feet, there's the under area of his foot. His foot rotates all the way around. The same thing can be said on the other side, too. Normally, McFarlane toys would be notorious for having pre-posed arms, where one arm does something different than what the other arm is. In the case here of Violator, he seems to be pretty symmetrical, not from the sculpt standpoint, but at least from a posability standpoint. He's pretty much the same on one side as he is on the other. It's funny, after all these years of reviewing and different toys, different collectibles and stuff like that, it's funny enough that I would still go back to a review that I did back in 2012 and still look at a figure that I did back then as one of my all-time favorites. Despite all the things I've reviewed on this channel, Violator is a figure I can still go back to from time to time. I can appreciate the sculpt. He is still one of my favorite characters from the 90s. This figure, I think, personifies Violator perfectly. They could very well give us a brand new Violator. McFarlane may very well entertain the idea of doing that, like an all-star wave or something like that. But I don't think there's very few chance that they could probably top this existing figure. I love the sculpt. The posability, of course, could be changed here and there, but I would entertain the idea that a figure like this doesn't necessarily have to have a whole ton of different posability joints. Something such as knees, the back ankles and stuff like that, I wouldn't hinge. If I had this figure hinged in those areas, the figure wouldn't be doing what he's doing right now. He would be extremely loose and he would be flopping all over the place, which is some of the problems I've had with older NECA Alien figures who tried to accomplish the same sort of thing, giving you the option of being able to pose the figure in different ways by having hingeable knees and back ankles. Sometimes can be problematic with the figure surviving the test of time, with a figure not being loose and whatnot. Still, it's a fantastic sculpt. The paint is good. Everything about this figure I really like. He is easily one of my top 5 favorite figures of all time. Might I also add too, he's fairly inexpensive as well. So if you guys are looking to pick this guy for yourself, I don't feel like he's going to outright break the bank. He's still fairly affordable if you want to get him in the aftermarket, for example, like eBay and stuff like that. I would personally pick him up if I had the chance again. The fact that I already have 2 Violators, I can't see myself wanting to get another Violator. But then again, I did buy a second Violator for fear that I lost this one, or vice versa. So maybe, never know. Maybe I might actually pick up a third one and permanently keep it in the clamshell, and then I can have that on display. He's still, of all my figures I have in my collection, he is within my top, I would say, my top 5 favorite figures of all time. Today, once again, we are revisiting the McFarlane toys. This was the Spawn Classic Series 20, and this was Violator 3. If you guys like this video, certainly hit it with a like down below, and if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe to this channel, make sure you hit that little subscribe button down below. You won't miss a beat when it comes to future videos. If you also want to check out some of the figures and other collectibles that I've revisited, there's also a playlist on this channel specifically dedicated to throwbacks. So you want to see a new take on what I think of a figure that I've reviewed before, you'll want to head over to my throwback playlist and you can check out those videos once again. As always, guys, thanks for watching as you always do. I'll see you next time.